And one of the questions that comes up quite frequently is, why do we study anxiety disorders? Why do we care? The reason is that anxiety disorders are very common. 30% of adults will experience an anxiety disorder in their lifetime. Most of them will experience, about a quarter of them will experience more than one anxiety disorder. And anxiety disorders begin in childhood. The mean age of onset of anxiety disorders is ages 12 to 15, so they begin very young. About 20% of children worldwide, 20 to 30% of children worldwide will develop an anxiety disorder while they're still children. So it's a very common disorder. Here's a graph showing the age of onset of anxiety disorders, and as you can see, symptoms start, or kids start to have symptoms starting around the age of 6 or 7. And by the age of 15, more than 50% of those who will develop an anxiety disorder have already developed it. So we want to catch the symptoms early. By the time kids are 20 to 25, almost all of them who are going to develop an anxiety disorder will have developed one. That's in comparison to mood disorders, depression, bipolar disorders, dysthymia, where most children don't start developing symptoms until age 16 or 17, and the median age of onset for mood disorders is age 25, 26, 27. So anxiety disorders start before mood disorders. Anxiety disorders are also very disabling. A recent study by the WHO has shown that anxiety disorders are as disabling as chronic physical illnesses like cardiac disease, rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes. They're actually more disabling than mood disorders or substance abuse. And even mild anxiety, which wouldn't necessarily get you to see a doctor or a psychiatrist, is very expensive. We also know that anxiety is genetic or heritable, but it's only partly genetic. The genetic contribution to anxiety depends a bit on the anxiety disorder that you're examining, but overall the risk is somewhere between 40 and 50. The contribution to anxiety by genetics, by genes, is somewhere between 30 and 45%. That means that somewhere between 60 and 70% is not genetic, which is important to know, it's environmental. The genetic risk is stable across development, so the genetic risk is the same for childhood anxiety disorders and for adulthood disorders. But it's not specific to a particular type of anxiety. So if your parent has panic disorder, you are at increased risk for anxiety, but you're not necessarily at increased risk for panic disorder. You could also get generalized anxiety disorder, separation anxiety, social anxiety disorder, any of the above. Early recognition and intervention for these disorders is the key. Currently, even though we know that anxiety is genetic, there's no known test for looking at who will and who won't develop an anxiety disorder genetically. And as we know from lots of studies, both of anxiety disorders and other disorders, having a genetic predisposition does not necessarily mean that you will develop the disease. A good example of that is cardiac disease. A lot of people are at increased risk for cardiac disease because they have a strong family history. But changing diet, changing exercise, changing stress levels, taking medication can prevent the development of cardiac disease quite effectively. The same is true for diabetes, and the same is actually true for psychiatric illnesses, so that if you know that somebody is at increased risk and you take steps to intervene early, you can actually do quite a bit to prevent the development. A really good example of that is a study that was done at Johns Hopkins, I think about 3 years ago. That study took 20 children, I think 20 children, ages 10 to 15, who had a parent with an anxiety disorder, and put them in a treatment group, and 20 children, again the same ages, who had a parent with an anxiety disorder, and put them in a control group. It's important to know that none of the children actually had significant symptoms of anxiety during the study. They did not meet criteria for any of the anxiety disorders. They just had a family history. The intervention group got 10 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy in a group session. The control group got kind of weekly supportive meetings and psychoeducation. There was also a parent intervention component to it, which the intervention group got. They followed the children a year later, so they got 10 weeks of intervention. A year later, 30% of the children in the control group had developed a clinically important anxiety disorder that needed treatment. None of the children in the intervention group had developed an anxiety disorder. So it's very clear that early intervention, even before the development of clinically significant illness, was having an impact on later outcome. The other thing that was important is that the anxiety levels started out the same between the two groups, and a year later, the anxiety levels for the intervention group were lower than they started out. The anxiety levels for the group that was not treated were actually higher than they started out. So even on an overall level, those kids that didn't develop an anxiety disorder still had higher levels of anxiety a year later. The kids that did get an intervention had much lower levels. So clearly, identifying kids who are at risk can really help, and it's really important. So we need to identify kids who have high levels of anxiety symptoms or kids who are otherwise known to be at risk. But we also need to identify protective factors. Not everybody who has a risk for anxiety will go on to develop it. So what's protecting them? That's the resilience concept that Anna talked about, and that's one of the things that we're looking at here in this study. Am I talking too fast? No, okay. See, okay. Sí, okay. Lo siento. Let's see if I can slow this down. I'm not going to talk too much about resilience because Anna talked about that quite a bit, but just as a reminder, resilience is really a protective factor against all types of psychiatric disorders. That's how we conceptualize it in this study. Normally, when we're looking at psychiatric illness or mental health, we look at it in the context of external factors such as trauma, adversity, violence, social, economic deprivation. But we can also examine it in the context of internal factors. So looking at it in the context of somebody who's at genetic risk or increased risk of developing anxiety disorder, like those kids that I talked about the intervention. The types of resilience that she talked about are the external and internal kinds of resilience. So in addition to looking at external risk and internal risk, we can also look at external forms of resilience and internal forms of resilience. And our interest is really in the internal forms, the way people relate to each other, their self-esteem, their self-concept. External or situational resilience, the examples of that are parental attachment, social support, economic stability, access to medical care, environmental stability, educational and work opportunities. And that's actually important because I'll come back to why we're doing this study in Costa Rica in a minute. Psychological resilience looks at personal confidence, self-efficacy, assertiveness, and something called pro-social norms, which is how you view your place in society, in family, in your school or work situation, in the larger world. Can I make a difference to my family? Can I make a difference to the world? Am I important? Does what I do matter? And are other people important to me? Is the reverse of that. So the hypothesis here is that psychological resilience may be more highly associated with protection against psychiatric illness, such as anxiety and depression, than external resilience is. It may also be more amenable to intervention at the individual level, like I talked about in these kids, or maybe at the level of the school. So if we screen kids and we identify kids who are at high risk at the school level, school counselors, school psychologists may be able to do group level interventions, either at classroom levels or pull kids out of classes. That's the idea. This is a study that I find really interesting. This is the Ugandan child soldier study. This is a study of 330 child soldiers who at the time of the study were 11 to 17, 50% of them were female, who had been conscripted into the army during the unrest, significant unrest in Uganda, and essentially exposed to horrific violence. They were at risk for their lives. They were forced to kill other people, including family members. It was really just the most extreme form of violence and trauma exposure that you can essentially imagine. And they went through this for many years, and they went through this very young, because at the time that they were looked at this study, they were teenagers. So what is our study? We've been here in Costa Rica doing genetic studies for many years, and in the last year or so have implemented an epidemiologic study in the population. The idea is to survey 5,000 school-age children in colegios, ages 12 to 18 in the Central Valley, from a random selection of schools, and I'll talk about the schools in a minute. They will get anxiety questionnaires to determine their risk for anxiety, mood questionnaires, because anxiety and mood are very related to each other, and resilience measures. 20% of those children will be randomly chosen to undergo intensive psychiatric interviewing to determine the presence of psychiatric illness, the types of psychiatric illness, the severity of the symptoms, and the relationship between the screening measures. The hypothesis